It was a peaceful morning. A dark, colored car quietly moved through an empty suburban neighborhood. Behind the wheel sat a black man, his face calm, his eyes weary after a long night of training. He had no idea that in just a few minutes, his entire life would be turned upside down. A red light. A siren blares. A patrol car starts tailing him. Then, suspicious stares, sharp words, aggressive behavior, all aimed at him, simply because he didn't look like what they considered normal. But what the two officers didn't know, was that the man they were forcing to kneel wasn't someone they could command. And when that ID card fell to the ground, it was already too late. An unexpected turn. A truth that would make the entire police unit bow their heads. Don't look away. Because in the next few minutes, you'll understand why respect should never depend on appearances. The morning had just begun. The air was still heavy with dew, and a light breeze rustled the trees lining both sides of the street, making the leaves tremble as if still half asleep. The suburban neighborhood lay in a typical early, weak silence, when most people hadn't yet left their homes. Somewhere in the distance, birds chirped faintly, echoing through the stillness. A dark, colored car moved quietly through narrow turns. The engine purred smoothly, and the tires glided over the pavement without a sound. Behind the wheel was a black man, likely in his early 40s. He wore a dark athletic jacket, the sleeves rolled up to reveal hardened calluses and an empty space on his hand, where two fingers used to be. His gaze was fixed straight ahead, calm and determined. In the morning light, his face showed signs of fatigue, but not weakness. It was the weariness of someone long used to endurance, steady through whatever came his way. His car wasn't speeding, weaving, or doing anything suspicious. But across the intersection ahead, a police patrol car rolled by. As they passed, the officer in the passenger seat glanced toward his car with a flicker of suspicion. They hadn't seen anything concrete, but then, a voice crackled through their radio, alert from the Maple Street convenience store. Suspect fled the scene. Dark, colored vehicle. Plates start with 75. The officers looked again. The car they had just passed, the first two digits matched. Maybe it was a coincidence. But in their line of work, suspicion was reason enough to act. A black man, alone, driving early in the morning, was enough. The officer behind the wheel tapped the turn signal and circled around. The patrol car began following at a distance. The man driving didn't seem to notice. His eyes stayed forward, expression unchanged. He had just finished an overnight training shift and was heading home for some rest. But he didn't know, this day wouldn't end like the others. The space between the two vehicles remained steady, not too close, not too far. Then the man began to sense something was off. In his rearview mirror, he saw the patrol car keeping the same distance through several turns. His brows furrowed slightly. But instead of panic, he just tightened his grip on the wheel and took a deep breath. His face showed no fear, only readiness. Not for a chase, but for another kind of confrontation. One quieter. One that cuts deeper, prejudice. Behind him, inside the patrol car, the tension was rising. The officer driving glanced at his partner and gave a subtle signal. The other nodded, hand moving quickly to the radio. Approaching possible suspect. Requesting backup if necessary. A traffic stop was about to happen. According to protocol. Reasonable on paper. But what these officers didn't know was that they were about to enter a situation they would regret for the rest of their lives. The car had barely pulled over when the patrol vehicle crept up behind it. Red and blue lights kept flashing, sweeping across the pavement and the car's body like suspicious eyes scanning every detail. The patrol car doors swung open. Both officers stepped out almost simultaneously. They didn't rush, but they didn't stroll either, moving straight ahead with high, alert posture. Their right hands rested instinctively on their holsters, either out of habit or as an unspoken warning. To them, the man behind the wheel wasn't just someone heading home after a long shift. He was now a subject, unknown, potentially dangerous. No greeting. No introductory question. Not even an explanation for the stop. Just one short, dry command, license and registration. The black man remained seated. He didn't act surprised or hurried. His gaze lowered slightly, and he calmly reached into the pocket of his jacket. Every movement was slow and deliberate, as if practiced through 100 similar scenarios. He pulled out his license and registration, extending both hands toward the window, voice low and steady, "You're welcome to check." The officer took the documents, glancing at the man with clear hesitation. Everything was in order. But instead of acknowledging that, he flipped through the papers, furrowed his brows, and muttered, "Nice car you've got there." A sentence that seemed casual, but beneath it was skepticism, maybe even mockery, not about the car, but about the man driving it. His eyes drifted to the hand resting on the steering wheel. He immediately noticed something unusual: the left hand was missing 2 fingers. His eyes flickered, and he glanced sideways at his partner. A nudge with the elbow. A smirk. Then a whisper, just loud enough, probably got into it with a knife or something. They both snickered quietly, a laugh laced with smugness. They didn't bother asking what happened. Empathy wasn't on their minds. To them, the man didn't need to be understood, he just needed to be checked. The man remained silent. He heard every word, saw every glance, every curl of the lips. But his face stayed composed. His silence wasn't fear, it was familiarity. His calm wasn't cold, it was the kind of endurance that had long become second nature. One of the officers leaned on the car door, bending lower. "What kind of job lets you afford a car like this?" It sounded casual, but the implication was clear, as if a black man couldn't possibly have a legitimate reason to own such a vehicle. The man didn't answer right away. He looked directly at the officer, not with avoidance, not with anger. Just a steady, quiet gaze, deep and unmoving, like still water. Eyes that didn't resist, but also refused to be disrespected without leaving a mark. The officer stood still for a moment. Strangely, the silence made him more uneasy than angry. But they kept pushing, because they believed they were doing their job. What they didn't know was that, at that very moment, they were already stepping into a grave mistake. A mistake they would come to regret, not just for what it led to, but for the way they chose to see a man, through the narrow lens of prejudice. The roadside remained quiet, but the tension between the 3 men had grown heavy. One of the officers stepped closer, his eyes sharp. His voice, once held in check, was now beginning to fray. "Step out of the car." The black man looked directly at them, completely unafraid. He didn't argue. He simply asked, calmly, "What did I do wrong? Could you please tell me the reason?" That simple question was enough to spark impatience. The other officer scowled, snapping back in a tone that sounded offended at being asked to explain. "Why would you need a reason? If you've got nothing to hide, why even ask?" It wasn't an answer. It was a dismissal of his right to know, a subtle way of stripping away the basic fairness in communication. In their eyes, he didn't need an explanation. He just needed to follow orders. Without waiting for a response, one of the officers suddenly stepped forward and yanked the driver's door open. The door swung out with a sharp metallic click that cut through the still air. It wasn't just an action, it was a show of authority, an intentional attempt to dominate. The man didn't react. He unbuckled his seat belt, released his hands from the wheel, and stepped out slowly. His expression remained calm, but the corners of his lips tightened. Not from anger, but from restraint, an effort to avoid falling into the trap of emotion. He stood tall. No retreat. No bowed head. But no provocation either. His stance, his eyes, all radiated quiet resolve. A silence that made the officers slightly uneasy, though they hid it by applying more pressure. One officer shoved his hand into the man's jacket pocket. No request. No permission. He yanked out the wallet, flipped it open, and began rummaging through. While doing so, he muttered mockingly, "Just checking your ID, nothing to stress about." The other officer scanned him from head to toe, then scoffed, "Nice suit. Fancy car. Trying a bit too hard to look respectable, huh?" The man didn't respond. But something in his gaze began to shift, deeper, heavier. Not anger, but exhaustion. As if this wasn't the first time. And likely wouldn't be the last. What began as suspicion had now twisted into something else, contempt. The vague remarks, the snide laughter, the belittling stares, they were all pieces of an invisible wall, built not because of anything he had done, but because of who he was, and the skin he wore. One officer circled behind him, deliberately close, his breath warm against the back of the man's neck. "No one ever given you this much attention before? Or is this your first time getting some real concern?" It wasn't a question. It was a degradation. Still, the man said nothing. His shoulders gave the slightest shrug, as if trying to shake off the weight pressing down from behind. He knew, if he reacted now, it would be the perfect excuse to escalate things. So he stayed still. Upright. Eyes steady. Mouth shut. He didn't need to shout to protect himself. He chose silence, the kind of silence only those who've endured deep humiliation truly understand. Meanwhile, the two officers continued scrutinizing him, as if determined to find just one flaw, one crack to use against him. But nothing stuck. The man, though wordless, was controlling the situation with nothing but composure. And that, more than anything, was what unsettled them the most. The so-called inspection had long crossed any professional boundary. It was no longer about duty, it had turned into psychological suppression. Every action, every look, every word wasn't meant to clarify anything, but simply to diminish the man standing at the center of their prejudice. One of the officers lit a cigarette and took a long, deep drag. Then he stepped up, face close to the black man's, and muttered in a low, gritty voice, "Relax a little, will you?" He exhaled a thick cloud of smoke directly into the man's face. There was no attempt to hide the intention. The acrid smoke stung the eyes and nose, but the man didn't flinch, didn't cough. His face remained unchanged, silent, calm, disturbingly composed. His eyes were wide open, staring straight ahead without blinking. Only his jaw clenched slightly, as if holding back emotions that had no room to escape. The other officer glanced at the scene and let out a scoffing laugh. He turned his gaze to the car and sneered, "Bet he borrowed this ride to show off. All dressed up too, really trying to play important, huh?" Not stopping there, they moved toward the fabric bag resting on the passenger seat. One of them grabbed it and tossed it to the ground like it was suspicious. They crouched and began rifling through it. Ordinary personal items were scattered across the asphalt, a leather wallet, a water bottle, some sticky notes, a small notebook torn from its zipper and dropped face down on the road. No one picked anything up. No one cared. The act wasn't investigative, it was deliberate public degradation. A sudden hacking sound rang out behind him. One of the officers, now circling to the man's left, bent slightly and spat near his feet. Less than a foot away. A small, dark blot on the pavement, an unspoken mark of contempt. The man didn't step back. Didn't look down. Didn't react. His face stiffened, not from fear, but from swallowing a feeling far too familiar, the sense of being treated as inferior, despite having done nothing wrong. One officer pulled his hand from his pocket and slowly raised his middle finger, holding it directly in the man's face. The gesture was neither rushed nor accidental, it was deliberate. His lips curled into a cruel smirk, tight and satisfied. A smile fueled by the power to humiliate someone who refused to fight back. "Got nothing to say, huh?" he growled, voice low and sharp, slicing through the air. Still no response. Only the man's eyes remained steady, wide open, unshaken. That gaze made the officer involuntarily glance away for a brief second, as if, for a moment, he saw something too deep, too firm, something beyond his reach, and beyond his control. No one expected that the man's composure would be what infuriated them most. They wanted defiance, an insult, a shout. But he gave them none of that. His calmness disoriented them. And it was that very calmness, silent, non-confrontational, that made them feel smaller than they'd ever felt. The man didn't need to prove anything. He just stood there, like a shadow cast tall across a warped light. And in those few minutes, no one could tell any more who truly held the power. The air had grown thick, like a layer of invisible fog smothering the entire street. There was no conversation anymore, no more routine checks. Every word spoken earlier had turned to ash, leaving only stares, confrontation, and a swelling hostility inside the men in uniform. One of the officers suddenly stepped forward. His face was tense, fists clenched tight at his sides. Then he barked, voice cutting through the stifling silence like a blade, "Sit on the ground. Now." His voice was hoarse and heavy, not just an order, but a release of anger long held in. Power, in that moment, felt threatened, not by defiance, not by violence, but by a man who refused to submit, yet didn't resist either. The man's silence, unshaken and calm, had pushed them to their edge. The black man didn't move. He remained standing. Back straight, shoulders open, hands relaxed by his sides. But his eyes didn't flinch. There was no defiance, no pleading, just silence. A silence so deep, it made people uneasy. They weren't used to this kind of silence. Silent, but unyielding. Quiet, but louder than any argument. And they couldn't bear it. Another officer stepped forward, no longer able to control himself. He shoved the man firmly in the shoulders, not a punch, not a blow, but a clear message: "You will kneel." The man froze for half a second, then lowered his left knee to the ground. Then his right. One hand rested lightly on the pavement for balance. But his back didn't hunch. His head didn't bow. Even in the lowest position, his posture held a quiet dignity that refused to break. The other officer walked up silently. In his hand was a nearly empty paper cup of coffee, left over from his overnight shift. He glanced at his partner, then at the man kneeling before him. His lips curled into a crooked smile. No words were exchanged, but the look in his eyes spoke clearly: contempt, and the twisted satisfaction of having full power to humiliate someone. He raised the cup without warning, and flung it at the man's chest. The warm coffee splattered across his shirt, leaving dark, soaking stains. A few drops landed on his neck and chin. The man closed his eyes for a brief moment. Not because it hurt, but because it was cold. Not the coffee, but the raw, deliberate disrespect. He didn't speak. He didn't brush the liquid off. He didn't wipe his face. He opened his eyes, and kept them fixed straight ahead. No shouting. No reaction. No attempt to defend himself. And that, more than anything, unsettled them. "So what? The silence means you're guilty now," one officer muttered, almost as if trying to reassure himself. But the words fell flat, like a stone dropped into a deep well, no echo, no reply. Still, the man said nothing. He only stared. And that stare, steady and clear, made the officer hesitate. Just for a moment. His hand, which was holding the handcuffs, paused midair. The air seemed to tighten. But instinct took over. The officer pulled the cuffs from his belt. The cold clinking of metal filled the space like the sound of a fate being sealed. He stepped forward, hand extended, ready to clasp the cuffs around the man's wrists. But just then, the man shifted slightly to one side. A barely noticeable movement. And with it, something small slipped from his right pocket. Clack. A soft sound. Harmless, on its own. But in this moment, within this choking silence, it landed like metal against stone. Both officers looked down at the same time. A small rectangular plastic card lay on the ground. It was the small plastic card, lying motionless on the pavement, reflecting the faint morning sunlight. No one expected that something so seemingly insignificant would mark the boundary between wrongdoing and realization. One of the two officers slowly bent down, his hands no longer carrying the same decisiveness as before. His fingers touched the edge of the card, flipping it gently. In an instant, his eyes froze. His mouth opened slightly as if to speak, but no words came out. He stood still. His lips twitched, eyes locked on the words printed on the card. His brow furrowed, then relaxed. His grip on the card tightened, as though trying to convince himself what he was holding was real. "Wait, is this?" His voice cracked, dry and nearly choked. The other officer snatched the card and glanced quickly. As soon as he reached the line showing the title, his face turned pale. His eyebrows tightened, eyes widened, and he turned to his partner as if needing confirmation. Neither of them stood tall anymore. Their shoulders slumped, their stance awkward, like children caught doing something wrong. Slowly, they looked up, turning their eyes toward the man still kneeling on the pavement. But this time, their gaze was different. No more suspicion. No more hostility. No more superiority. What remained was confusion, mixed with fear. And deep inside, a growing shame creeping into every breath. At that moment, a siren wailed from afar, soft but clear enough to pull them back to the present. A second patrol car approached. The door opened. From the driver's seat stepped a man in a commanding uniform, his posture firm, eyes sharp, quickly scanning the scene. But the moment his eyes met the man being held down, his entire expression changed. His stride faltered. The stern look on his face softened. He stared at the kneeling man. Not with scrutiny, but with recognition. A recognition filled with respect. "Oh my God," he murmured, almost under his breath, but everyone heard it. "That's the Federal Special Operations Instructor." His words struck like a bolt of lightning. No one responded. No one asked for clarification. Silence fell over the entire scene, as if the air had been sucked out. The two officers stood frozen. The hand holding the cuffs hung loose by one side. The other still gripped the card, but could no longer look at it. They simply stood there, silent, eyes flicking from the ground up to the man before them, now seen through an entirely different lens. The man had not yet risen. He remained kneeling. Not because he was forced to, but because he saw no need to change positions. His head was slightly bowed, eyes cast downward, but his presence was commanding enough that no one dared move. He didn't have to speak. The card had spoken for him. His history, his character, had spoken for him. In the officers' minds now played a montage, flashing like a fast-forwarded film, the yelling, the mocking stares, the coffee splashed on his chest, the clinking handcuffs. Each image sliced into their self-respect like a blade turned inward. No one needed to reprimand them. They already knew, deeply, that what they had done was not only wrong, but a disgrace to someone they should have honored. And not just because the man held a title, but because he was someone they had studied in their own training modules. A figure described as the embodiment of courage, discipline, and quiet sacrifice. The very man who now stood before them, not as a teacher in a classroom, but as someone they had just dishonored, without knowing he was the one who had taught them. No one had to say another word. No further proof was needed. In that fleeting moment, both officers understood, they had made a mistake they could never undo. The commanding officer walked toward the man with a calmness that contrasted with how he first arrived. Each step he took seemed to carry the weight of a truth that had just come to light. His eyes stayed fixed, and the stern expression on his face had softened, now mixed with surprise, regret, and a very human touch of confusion. As he neared, he gave a slight bow, his shoulders dipping in a gesture of respect. "I sincerely apologize," he said, his voice lowered. "They didn't know. But I do. Very well." As soon as the words left his mouth, the air around them grew strangely still. The two officers standing a few feet away flinched slightly. They glanced at each other, then turned to their superior. Their eyes were filled with confusion. They didn't understand what was happening. Why would their superior apologize to a man they had just forced to kneel? But only seconds later, the explanation came, and it hit them like a deep cut to what remained of their pride. The commander raised his head, eyes scanning all three men, and spoke clearly, each word hitting like a strike to the minds of those who had gone too far. He once led a hostage rescue operation in the South. When the suspect was about to detonate a device, he was the only one who rushed in without hesitation. The explosion didn't happen, but he lost 2 fingers holding the man's hand down. And he saved 3 lives, including a 6-year-old girl. He paused. Not to catch his breath, but to give the 2 officers a moment to truly grasp the scale of their mistake. He's also the one who rewrote the hand combat training manual for the entire force. That includes your class, he said, turning to them. His tone remained calm, but now carried more weight. Many high-ranking officers were directly trained by him. Myself included. The 2 officers stood speechless. One's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Their eyes widened, unable to hide the shock. One of them swallowed hard, throat tightening, chest rising and falling. The other stared down at the card still in his hand, as if wanting to double-check, though he already knew there was no mistake. The mocking words they had uttered earlier now echoed in their minds like the sound of ignorance thrown back at them. Bet he borrowed the car just to show off. Dressed up like he's trying to look respectable. Silent means guilty, right? Those lines weren't jokes anymore. They were stains, etched into memory. The man was still standing there. He said nothing. No smirk. No triumphant reaction, like most people might show when the truth is finally on their side. He simply looked calm, just as he had been from the beginning. But this time, his eyes weren't looking up. He had stood tall again. And from where he was now, he looked down at the 2 officers, not with contempt, but with something higher, something that had moved beyond. None of them could understand how he remained so composed. They didn't know that to achieve such calm, he had endured countless moments of being doubted, stopped, and disrespected, simply because of who he was and the color of his skin. The commander gave a quiet nod, a wordless thank you. Then he stepped back, leaving space around the 2 officers who stood with their heads lowered. They didn't dare look up. They couldn't meet the man's eyes. Not because they feared punishment, but because they knew, the one they had disrespected was a mirror, showing them the narrowness within themselves. No one yelled. No one scolded. But what had just unfolded, and the man's silence, were the deepest form of judgment they could ever receive. There are people who don't need to raise their voice. They don't need titles to be respected. It's the way they live, the way they remain silent, the way they rise, that makes others bow their heads. After a long, breathless silence, The commanding officer turned around. He didn't need to think. His voice rang out firmly, with no hesitation, "Remove the cuffs." Immediately. The sharp command hit like a bell tolling in the minds of the two stunned officers. The one holding the cuffs flinched, his hands visibly shaking. He stepped forward, bent down, fumbling with the key. The metallic clink echoed in the dead silence, like the sound of a mistake finally unmasked. The lock clicked open. The cuffs sprang loose. The man slowly withdrew his hands, not hurried, not reluctant. Red marks circled his wrists, but he didn't look down. His gaze remained steady, as if what had just happened had left no visible trace. One of the two officers, the one who had unlocked the cuffs, stepped back. His face turned pale, eyes fixed on the ground. His lips moved slightly. Then, as if he couldn't bear the weight any longer, he mumbled, his voice so low only those close by could hear, I didn't know. If I had known." The man turned to him, expressionless. A quiet breath, then he spoke, low, clear, calm, not loud, but powerful enough that no one dared interrupt. "It's not about knowing who I am, it's about knowing how to treat a human being." Just one sentence. No drama. But every word hit like a slap to the pride of those around him. No one could argue. Because everyone knew, it was the truth. He turned and walked toward his car. His pace wasn't fast, but it was steady. Coffee stains still marked his shirt. His pants were still dusty at the knees. But there was no weakness in his stride. He opened the door, sat inside. No glances back. No parting words. The officers remained frozen. No one moved. Only their eyes followed the car as it rolled away from the scene. The hum of the engine was soft as wind, but it left behind a storm in the hearts of those who had just witnessed the truth. No one was yelled at. No one was scolded. But there was no need. The man's composure, his refusal to retaliate, and the dignity in his silence, were the deepest form of punishment. One officer in the back, still looking down, whispered, "We messed with the wrong man." No one responded. The words rang out like a confession, quiet but piercing. Those who had once given orders now stood in silence. No more harsh stares. No more loud voices. Just downcast faces, tight lips, and eyes filled with regret. No moral lecture needed. No written reprimand. The lesson had already been made clear, and it had come at a cost. It was the feeling of being judged by your own conscience. And the most painful part, wasn't being seen in the wrong by others, but realizing you had treated a man with cruelty, a man who deserved nothing but respect. A man who didn't need power to command it. A man who didn't need to raise his voice to make others fall silent. A man who, with silence alone, had silenced everyone else. The precinct's meeting room that afternoon was unusually quiet. The air was thick, as if a storm was looming overhead. No one spoke. No one dared meet the captain's eyes. Every sound was muffled, leaving only the steady ticking of the wall clock cutting through the silence. The captain stood at the head of the table, hands clasped in front of him, eyes locked on the two men seated across from him. His face showed no anger, but neither did it carry softness. His gaze pressed down on every unspoken word in the room. After a long, drawn out silence, he finally spoke. His voice was short, firm, like a sentence already decided. "You are both suspended pending an internal investigation." That single sentence didn't just end the meeting, it triggered a quiet collapse inside the two men seated before him. The younger officer turned to the captain, as if to say something. His face had gone pale, beads of sweat dotted his forehead. His mouth opened, eyes wide with panic. We didn't know who he was. The situation was tense, but the captain didn't let him finish. He raised his hand, not forcefully, just enough to silence any attempt at justification. His voice dropped, not loud, but heavier than any reprimand. You didn't need to know who he was. You didn't need titles. You didn't need medals. If someone did nothing wrong, no one has the right to humiliate them. He looked at each of them, his gaze cutting deep. This mistake wasn't about procedure. It wasn't about technique. The mistake was how you saw another human being, and how you acted when you thought you had power. Neither of them replied. There was nothing left to say. Both simply lowered their heads. Their backs no longer straight. Shoulders drooped. Eyes fixed on the table. That afternoon, in the break room down the hall, the usual chatter had vanished. Just a few small groups, scattered and quiet. Word is, he saved hostages down south. Nearly lost his arm, he wrote the new training manual for the rapid response team. The captain himself was trained by him back in the day. A young recruit, fresh out of the academy, his uniform still crisp, sat silently by the coffee machine. He didn't speak loudly, but his voice was clear, slow. So, that was the lead instructor from Special Operations. No one replied. But the room fell still. These little stories spread, not loudly, not dramatically. They didn't need headlines. They traveled through glances, through silence, through hesitant nods. That man, the one who had been humiliated, forced to kneel, doused with coffee, cuffed, never came back to demand justice. He never spoke out to explain or protest. He simply walked away, in silence, with the same upright posture he held when being mistreated. And that, more than anything, made the others feel small. He didn't need revenge. He didn't need to expose anyone. He didn't need to slam a table to reclaim his honor. His composure, the way he walked out of that situation with eyes free of anger, with a silence heavier than 100 words, was the greatest lesson they had ever received. A lesson not found in textbooks. Not taught in classrooms. But etched into the soul, piece by piece, through the raw sting of shame. And sometimes, the one who says nothing, leaves the longest echo in the minds of those who once thought they could act without consequence. There are people who can walk into a room without saying a single word, and yet their presence alone makes everyone fall silent. Not because they hold power. Not because they are famous. But because they carry a calmness, a quiet strength, and the aura of someone who knows exactly who they are, and doesn't need to prove it to anyone. The man in this story didn't get angry. He didn't fight back. He didn't seek revenge. He chose silence. A silence not of weakness, but of incredible inner strength. A silence that forced those around him to reflect, and realize they were wrong, not just in action, but in thought. He never asked to be respected. But it was the way he refused to bow, the way he stayed composed even while being insulted and humiliated, that made others bow their heads in front of him. We live in a world where the first glance is often the most mistaken. We rush to judge others by the color of their skin, by the clothes they wear, by the car they drive, or by their choice to stay silent in a noisy situation. But we forget, behind a scar could be a heroic story. Behind simple clothing might be a teacher who trained the best. And behind a calm gaze may be a heart that once sacrificed itself to protect others, without ever asking for credit. Mistakes made in a single moment can happen to anyone. But some mistakes, if left uncorrected, become permanent stains, not because of their consequences, but because of the shame that resurfaces every time we remember them. That's why we must not wait to know who someone is before treating them properly. We should start by recognizing that every person deserves respect, even when we know nothing about them. Because respect is not something others must earn. It's something we choose to give, to show that we understand what it means to be human. If this story made you reflect, please share it, so that more people can understand that what we show on the outside is never more valuable than what we hold firm inside. Leave your thoughts below. Your comments, reflections, or even personal experiences may be exactly what someone else needs to hear. And if you want to keep hearing real, life stories, where people are at the center, and the lessons come from truth. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Because sometimes, a short story can leave a long, lasting mark. And a single right look, can change an entire life.